Marcus Chen wiped grease from his hands with a worn cloth, the familiar smell of engine oil and metal shavings filling his nostrils. The orbital shipyard around Kepler Station buzzed with activity as dozens of species worked on various vessels, but Marcus preferred the quiet corner where he'd set up his repair shop. Here, he could focus on the intricate work of fixing hyperdrive motivators and plasma conduits without the constant chatter that filled the main bays. The day had started like any other. A Zelonian freighter needed its navigation array recalibrated, and a Thaxian scout ship required new fusion coils. Marcus had developed a reputation among the station's diverse population as someone who could fix anything mechanical, no matter how alien the technology. His human intuition for engineering, combined with an almost supernatural ability to understand how things worked, made him invaluable in a galaxy where most mechanics specialized in only their own species' technology. As he worked on a particularly stubborn gravity generator, Marcus heard an unusual sound echoing through the service corridors. It wasn't the typical hum of machinery or the chatter of workers. This was different, a rhythmic tapping followed by what sounded like frustrated huffing. Curiosity getting the better of him, Marcus set down his tools and followed the noise deeper into the station's maintenance sections. The sound led him to a storage bay that had been abandoned for months. As he peered around the corner, Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. Sitting in the middle of the dusty floor was a creature he'd only seen in the galactic databases, a dragon. But this wasn't the massive, fearsome beast of ancient Earth legends or the adult specimens that occasionally visited the station as part of diplomatic missions. This was clearly a juvenile, no larger than a house cat, with scales that shimmered between deep purple and midnight blue. The little dragon was attempting to breathe fire at a pile of metal scraps, presumably trying to melt them into some kind of nest or toy. However, instead of the expected flames, only small puffs of smoke emerged from its nostrils, followed by frustrated squeaks. The creature's tail lashed back and forth with annoyance, and its small wings fluttered uselessly as it tried again and again to produce even the smallest flame. Marcus found himself smiling despite the unusual situation. The little dragon reminded him of his nephew back on Earth, who used to throw similar tantrums when he couldn't master a new skill. Moving slowly so as not to startle the creature, Marcus stepped into the storage bay. The dragon immediately noticed him and let out a startled chirp, backing away until it hit the wall. Its large, intelligent eyes, a striking gold color, fixed on Marcus with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The mechanic raised his hands peacefully and crouched down to appear less threatening. "Hey there, little guy," Marcus said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the empty bay. "What are you doing all the way out here?" The dragon tilted its head, studying him with those remarkable golden eyes. It made a soft, trilling sound, almost like a question. Marcus had heard that dragons were among the most intelligent species in the galaxy, but seeing that level of awareness in such a young creature was still surprising. "You're pretty far from the diplomatic quarters," Marcus continued, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you lost?" The dragon's response was to try breathing fire again, this time with even less success than before. Only a small wisp of smoke emerged, and the little creature's shoulders slumped in defeat. It looked so dejected that Marcus felt his heart go out to it. "Having trouble with the fire-breathing, huh?" Marcus asked. "Don't worry, kid, everyone has to practice." An idea struck him then. Marcus remembered the small container of bubble solution he kept in his toolkit, a leftover from his nephew's last visit to his workshop on Earth. The boy had insisted on bringing his bubbles everywhere, and Marcus had found them oddly soothing during long repair jobs. The simple act of blowing bubbles had a meditative quality that helped him think through complex problems. "Wait here," Marcus told the dragon, though he doubted the creature understood human speech. He hurried back to his workshop and retrieved the small plastic bottle and wand from his toolbox. The solution was still good, and as he returned to the storage bay, he could see the little dragon waiting exactly where he'd left it. "Okay, so you can't make fire yet," Marcus said, settling cross-legged on the floor a few feet away from the dragon. "But I bet you can do this." He dipped the wand in the solution and brought it to his lips, blowing gently. A stream of iridescent bubbles floated through the air between them, catching the light from the overhead panels and creating tiny rainbows as they drifted toward the ceiling. The dragon's eyes went wide with wonder. It tracked the bubbles' movement with intense focus, its head swiveling to follow each one until they popped against the walls or ceiling. When the last bubble disappeared, the creature looked back at Marcus with what could only be described as amazement. "Pretty cool, right?" Marcus said, blowing another stream of bubbles. This time the dragon stood up, its earlier dejection forgotten. It reached out one small claw toward a particularly large bubble, watching in fascination as its touch made the sphere vanish. For the next hour, Marcus entertained the little dragon with bubble after bubble. The creature's delight was infectious. It chirped and trilled with excitement, occasionally attempting to catch bubbles in its mouth or bat at them with its tiny wings. Marcus found himself laughing along with the dragon's enthusiasm, amazed by how such a simple toy could bring so much joy to such an obviously intelligent being. As they played, Marcus began to notice details about his small companion. The dragon's scales weren't uniform in color. They seemed to shift and change based on the creature's mood, becoming brighter when it was excited and darker when it was concentrating. Its movements were graceful despite its apparent youth, and there was an underlying elegance to everything it did that spoke of an ancient and noble heritage. "You're pretty special, aren't you?" Marcus said as he prepared another round of bubbles. "I bet your family is worried sick about you." The dragon's mood seemed to shift at that comment, its scales darkening slightly. It made a soft, mournful sound and curled up into a small ball, tail wrapped around its body. Marcus realized he might have touched on a sensitive subject. "Hey, it's okay," he said quickly, setting aside the bubble solution. "Whatever's wrong, we'll figure it out together." The dragon looked up at him with those expressive golden eyes, and Marcus could swear he saw gratitude there. It was remarkable how much emotion such an alien face could convey. Slowly, the little creature uncurled itself and moved closer to Marcus, eventually settling down right next to his leg. "That's better," Marcus said softly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You know, I used to get lost when I was a kid too, scared my parents half to death, but someone always found me and brought me home safely." The dragon's scales began to brighten again, returning to their earlier purple-blue shimmer. It made a soft, rumbling sound that Marcus realized might be similar to a cat's purr. Encouraged, he continued talking. "The thing about being lost is that it feels scary at first, but sometimes it leads to the best adventures. I mean, if you hadn't wandered off, we never would have met, right? And then who would I have shared my bubbles with?" As if understanding his words, the dragon looked up at the bubble solution hopefully. Marcus chuckled and picked up the wand again. "All right, one more round, but then we should probably figure out how to get you back to wherever you came from." He blew a fresh stream of bubbles, and the dragon's excitement returned immediately. This time, however, something different happened. As one of the bubbles drifted close to the dragon's snout, the creature attempted to blow on it the same way Marcus had been doing. Instead of fire or smoke, a small puff of air emerged from its nostrils, sending the bubbles spinning away in a spiral pattern. The dragon stared in amazement at what it had accomplished, then looked at Marcus as if seeking approval. Marcus grinned widely. "That was fantastic, you see. You just needed to learn a different way to use your breath." Encouraged by this success, the dragon tried again with another bubble. This time, it managed to blow a gentle stream of air that kept a bubble aloft much longer than normal, making it dance and weave through the air like a tiny balloon. The dragon's delighted chirps filled the storage bay. Neither Marcus nor the dragon noticed the figure that had appeared silently in the doorway of the storage bay. Standing in the shadows, watching every interaction between the human mechanic and the small dragon, was a being of imposing presence and unmistakable authority. Dragon Queen Lyrelith Stormskill had been searching for her youngest offspring for hours. When little Zephyr had disappeared from the diplomatic quarters, every available member of her retinue had been dispatched to search the massive station. As the ruler of the Draconic Hegemony, one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, Lyrelith was accustomed to having her commands followed immediately and her problems solved efficiently. But this problem was personal. Zephyr was her youngest, barely out of the egg, and still struggling with the basic abilities that came naturally to most dragons. The little one's inability to breathe fire had been a source of growing concern, not because it reflected poorly on her lineage, but because she worried about how it affected Zephyr's confidence and happiness. Now, watching through the doorway as a human stranger entertained her child with some sort of primitive bubble-making device, Lyrelith found herself experiencing emotions she hadn't felt in decades. The pure joy on Zephyr's face, the patient kindness of the human, and the obvious bond that had formed between them in such a short time filled her with a complex mixture of gratitude and wonder. Dragons were ancient and proud beings, with lifespans measured in millennia and powers that could reshape worlds. They were respected and often feared throughout the galaxy, and for good reason. Yet here was a simple human mechanic, probably not even a century old, showing her child something that all her wisdom and power had been unable to provide: the simple pleasure of play and the confidence that came from small successes. The queen watched as Zephyr successfully guided another bubble through the air with careful puffs of breath, the little dragon's scales practically glowing with happiness. She saw how the human Marcus, according to the identification data her scanning implants provided, celebrated each small achievement as if it were a major victory. His genuine delight in Zephyr's progress was evident in every expression and gesture. As the impromptu bubble session continued, Lyrelith found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about humans and their place in the galactic community. She had always viewed them as newcomers, a young species with potential, but lacking the deep wisdom and power of the elder races. Yet this one human had accomplished something in an hour that she and her court advisors had been unable to do in months. He had made Zephyr truly happy. The queen's contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Two members of her royal guard were moving through the corridors, no doubt continuing their search for the missing prince. With a gesture that was barely more than a thought, she sent them a telepathic message to hold their position and remain silent. This moment was too important to interrupt. Back in the storage bay, Marcus was beginning to run low on bubble solution. The little dragon seemed to sense this and pressed closer to his side, as if trying to delay the inevitable end to their play session. Marcus found himself surprisingly reluctant to leave as well. There was something special about this little creature, something that touched a part of his heart he didn't even know existed. "You know," he said softly, scratching gently behind one of the dragon's small horns, "I don't really want this to end either, but I bet there are people looking for you, and they're probably really worried." The dragon's scales darkened again, and it made that same mournful sound as before. Marcus realized that whatever had led to the creature being alone in this storage bay, it wasn't a simple case of wandering off. There was something deeper going on here. "Tell you what," Marcus said, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. "How about I help you find your family, and maybe they'll let me visit sometimes. I could bring more bubbles." The dragon's scales brightened immediately, and it nuzzled against Marcus's hand affectionately. The trust and gratitude in that simple gesture nearly brought tears to the mechanic's eyes. Standing in the shadows, Queen Lyrelith felt something shift inside her ancient heart. This human had not only entertained her child and boosted Zephyr's confidence, but he had also shown a level of compassion and understanding that was rare even among her own kind. The offer to help find Zephyr's family, combined with the gentle way he handled her child's obvious emotional needs, revealed a character that transcended species boundaries. For the first time in her long reign, the Dragon Queen found herself considering the possibility that humanity might have something to offer the galaxy beyond their technical skills and stubborn determination. In this one human's kindness toward a lost dragon child, she saw a glimpse of something that could change the very nature of interspecies relations. But first, she needed to properly meet this remarkable mechanic. Stepping silently back into the shadows, Queen Lyrelith began to formulate a plan that would allow her to approach without revealing that she had been watching all along. After all, first impressions were important, and she wanted to observe Marcus's natural behavior when he didn't know he was in the presence of royalty. The fate of two species might well depend on how the next few hours unfolded. Marcus carefully sealed the bubble solution container and tucked it into his pocket, looking down at the small dragon who had remained pressed against his leg throughout the process. The little creature's golden eyes held an almost desperate quality, as if it feared being abandoned again. "All right, buddy," Marcus said gently, "let's go find your family, but first we need to figure out where to start looking." He stood slowly, giving the dragon time to adjust. To his surprise, the creature immediately spread its small wings and hopped up onto his shoulder, claws gripping carefully at his work shirt without tearing the fabric. The dragon's weight was negligible, but the warmth of its small body and the trust implicit in the gesture made Marcus's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Well, that settles the transportation question," he said with a soft laugh. "Guess we're doing this together." As they made their way through the station's corridors, Marcus drew curious stares from the various beings they passed. Dragons were not uncommon on Kepler Station, but seeing one so young and apparently bonded to a human was definitely unusual. Most alien species gave them a wide berth, whether out of respect or caution. Marcus decided their first stop should be the station's information hub. If a young dragon had gone missing, there would likely be some kind of alert or search notice in the system. As they walked, the dragon on his shoulder remained perfectly balanced despite the mechanic's somewhat clumsy gait. Occasionally, it would make small chirping sounds near his ear, as if commenting on the sights they passed. The information hub was located near the station's central plaza, a massive circular area that served as the heart of Kepler Station's social and commercial activity. Dozens of species mingled here, conducting business, sharing meals, or simply socializing. The cacophony of different languages and communication methods created a constant background hum that Marcus had long since learned to filter out. At the information terminal, Marcus accessed the station's public bulletin system. His search for missing dragon alerts came up empty, which struck him as odd. Surely someone would have reported the little creature's disappearance by now. He tried several different search terms, but found nothing that seemed related to his small companion. "That's weird," Marcus muttered, glancing at the dragon perched on his shoulder. "Either no one's reported you missing yet, or—" He didn't finish the thought, but a troubling possibility was beginning to form in his mind. What if this little dragon hadn't wandered off? What if it had been abandoned or was running away from something? The dragon seemed to sense his concern and nuzzled against his neck reassuringly. Marcus made another decision that surprised even himself. "Tell you what," he said quietly. "Let's go get you something to eat first. All that bubble blowing probably worked up an appetite." He knew there was a small cafe in the plaza that served food suitable for various species, including dragons. As they approached the establishment, Marcus noticed several beings pointing in their direction and whispering among themselves. The attention made him slightly uncomfortable, but the dragon on his shoulder seemed completely at ease. The cafe owner, a friendly Zelonian named Crix, greeted them with his characteristic four-armed gesture of welcome. His large, compound eyes focused on the small dragon with obvious interest. "Well now, Marcus," Crix said in his melodic voice, "I don't believe I've seen you with such distinguished company before." "Found this little guy in one of the storage bays," Marcus explained, carefully omitting the details of their meeting. "Seemed lost, so I'm trying to help find where he belongs." Crix's expression grew more serious. "A young dragon alone on the station? That is indeed unusual. Most dragon younglings are closely supervised by their families. Perhaps you should inform station security." Marcus had considered that option, but something about the dragon's earlier reaction when he mentioned family made him hesitate. "Maybe. Right now, I'm more concerned about making sure he's fed and safe. What would be appropriate food for someone his size?" The Zelonian consulted a dietary database on his tablet, his multiple arms working with impressive coordination. For a juvenile dragon of this apparent age, small portions of synthesized proteins would be ideal. Perhaps some of our stellar fish substitute? It's quite popular with dragon visitors. "Sounds perfect," Marcus said, settling into a booth near the cafe's viewing window. The dragon climbed down from his shoulder and curled up on the table, but remained alert and attentive to everything around them. While they waited for the food, Marcus found himself really looking at his small companion for the first time since their meeting. The dragon's scales caught the light from the viewing port, revealing subtle patterns and textures he hadn't noticed before. There was definitely something regal about the creature, an inherent dignity that seemed at odds with its apparent abandonment. The food arrived quickly, and Marcus watched in fascination as the dragon delicately consumed the protein substitute. Its table manners were impeccable, almost formal. This was clearly not a wild creature or even a young dragon from a lower status family. Everything about its behavior suggested noble breeding. "You're from an important family, aren't you?" Marcus said quietly. "That's why no one's reported you missing. They're handling the search privately." The dragon paused in its eating and looked at him with those expressive golden eyes. There was recognition there, and something that might have been relief at being understood. Before Marcus could pursue this line of thought further, a commotion near the cafe's entrance drew his attention. 3 figures in elaborate formal attire had entered the plaza, and other beings were quickly making way for them. Even at a distance, Marcus could see these were dragons, adult dragons, with an unmistakable air of authority and power. The small dragon on the table had noticed them too, and its reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of excitement at seeing potential family members, the creature's scales darkened to an almost black color, and it pressed itself low against the table as if trying to become invisible. "Not family, I take it," Marcus said softly, "or at least not family you want to see right now." The dragon's distressed chirp confirmed his suspicion. Marcus made a quick decision. "Come on," he said, scooping up the dragon and placing it back on his shoulder. "Let's get out of here." They slipped out of the cafe through a side entrance, but not before Marcus caught sight of one of the adult dragons scanning the plaza with obvious intent. These weren't just any dragons. Their elaborate dress and the way other beings deferred to them marked them as high-ranking members of dragon society, possibly even royalty. Marcus's mind raced as they made their way through the station's service corridors. If his little companion was indeed from a royal family and was hiding from what appeared to be official representatives, then the situation was far more complex than a simple case of a lost child. "Okay, buddy," Marcus said as they reached the relative safety of his workshop. "I think it's time we had a serious talk." He settled into his work chair and gently lifted the dragon from his shoulder, placing it on his workbench where they could face each other properly. The creature's scales were still dark with distress, but it seemed calmer now that they were away from the plaza. "I don't know what's going on with your family situation," Marcus began, "but I can see you're scared of something. And those dragons back there weren't just looking for any missing youngster, they were looking specifically for someone important." The dragon's head tilted slightly, as if it was considering how much to reveal. Then, to Marcus's amazement, it began to move in a series of deliberate gestures. The movements were too complex and purposeful to be random. This was clearly some kind of communication attempt. Marcus watched carefully, trying to understand what the dragon was telling him. The creature pointed to itself, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate size or status, perhaps small or young. Then it pointed toward the direction of the plaza and made what appeared to be an aggressive or threatening motion. "Someone back there wants to hurt you," Marcus guessed. The dragon shook its head and tried again. This time, it gestured to itself, then made a motion with its small claws that suggested something being taken away or removed. Then it pointed in the direction they had come from again. "They want to take you somewhere you don't want to go." This time, the dragon nodded vigorously, its scales brightening slightly with what might have been relief at being understood. It continued with its gestures, showing Marcus what appeared to be a story. It pointed to itself, then made motions suggesting flight or travel, then gestured to indicate being alone, and finally pointed all around them to indicate the station. "You ran away," Marcus said with sudden understanding. "You left home and came here on your own." The dragon's enthusiastic nodding confirmed his interpretation. But there was more to the story, Marcus realized. A creature this young couldn't have traveled through space alone, and dragons didn't typically run away from loving families without serious cause. "Were they trying to force you to do something you didn't want to do?" Marcus asked gently. The dragon's scales darkened again, and it made that same mournful sound he'd heard in the storage bay. Its gestures became more agitated as it tried to explain something complex. Marcus watched as it pointed to its mouth, then made the motion of breathing out, but then shook its head sadly. "This is about the fire breathing, isn't it?" Marcus said. "Someone's giving you trouble because you can't breathe fire yet." The dragon's scales went completely black, and it curled up into a small ball of misery. Marcus felt his heart break for the little creature. In his experience, pushing a child to achieve something before they were ready rarely led to anything but frustration and damaged self-esteem. "Hey," he said softly, reaching out to gently stroke the dragon's head. "There's nothing wrong with learning things at your own pace. Everyone develops differently." The dragon looked up at him with grateful eyes, but Marcus could see that whatever pressure it had been under back home was serious enough to drive it to run away. That suggested the problem went beyond simple impatience with a child's development. A soft chime from his workstation's communication panel interrupted his thoughts. Someone was trying to contact him through the station's internal network. Marcus hesitated, wondering if this might be related to his small companion, but decided he needed to answer normally to avoid suspicion. Marcus Chen, he said, activating the audio pickup. Mr. Chen, this is Station Administrator Velox. I have some individuals here who are asking about a missing dragon youngster. They seem to think you might have encountered one during your work in the service areas. Marcus felt the dragon tense on his workbench. The little creature's scales had gone so dark they were almost invisible in the workshop's shadows. I've been in my workshop most of the day, Marcus said carefully, which was technically true. What makes them think I would have seen anything? Apparently, several witnesses reported seeing a human matching your description in the central plaza with a young dragon. These individuals are quite insistent that the dragon in question belongs with them. The dragon on Marcus's workbench was shaking its head frantically, its golden eyes wide with fear. Whatever these individuals wanted, the little creature clearly didn't want to go with them. Well, I did grab lunch in the plaza earlier, Marcus said, buying time while he tried to figure out what to do. But I didn't notice any missing dragons. Have these people filed a proper missing person report with station security? There was a pause before Administrator Velox responded. That's an interesting point, Mr. Chen. I'll need to check on that. In the meantime, if you do encounter any lost dragon youngsters, please contact my office immediately. Of course, Marcus said, though he had no intention of honoring that request until he understood what was really going on. After ending the call, Marcus looked down at the small dragon, who was still trembling with fear. The sight made his decision for him. Don't worry, little guy, he said firmly. Nobody's going to force you to go anywhere you don't want to go, not while I'm around. The dragon's scales began to brighten again, and it made a soft, trilling sound that Marcus was beginning to recognize as contentment. But as he considered the implications of his promise, Marcus realized he might have just committed himself to protecting a runaway dragon from some very powerful beings. Unknown to both Marcus and the young dragon, their conversation had been observed. Queen Lyrelith had positioned herself where she could monitor the humans' communications, and what she had heard filled her with both admiration and concern. The individuals demanding Zephyr's return were members of the Draconic Council's old guard, dragons who believed that any youngling who couldn't breathe fire by a certain age was defective and should be sent to remedial institutions until they could master their abilities. The Queen had been fighting their influence for months, but their political power was considerable. Watching Marcus's protective response to her child's distress, Lyrelith realized she might have found an unexpected ally. This human's instinctive understanding of Zephyr's needs, combined with his willingness to protect the young dragon from harm, suggested possibilities she had never considered. The Queen began to formulate a plan that would test Marcus's character further while also protecting her child from the Council's interference. If this human mechanic proved worthy of the trust Zephyr had placed in him, it might change everything, not just for one small dragon, but for the future relationship between their species. Over the next few days, Marcus's workshop became an unlikely sanctuary. The small dragon, whom Marcus had taken to calling Zippy due to its quick movements and energetic personality, had settled into a routine that brought unexpected joy to both their lives. Each morning, the dragon would wake curled up in a nest of clean shop rags Marcus had arranged near his workbench, and together they would share a simple breakfast while Marcus planned his work for the day. The bubble sessions had become a regular occurrence, but they had evolved beyond simple play. Marcus had discovered that the dragon was actually using the exercises to develop breath control, and the improvement was remarkable. Where once Zippy could barely produce a puff of smoke, now the little creature could create gentle streams of warm air that could keep multiple bubbles aloft for extended periods. "You're getting really good at this," Marcus said, watching as Zippy guided 3 bubbles in a complex aerial dance using carefully controlled breaths. "I bet you could blow out candles from across the room now." The dragon's scales brightened with pride, but Marcus noticed there was still a shadow of sadness in those expressive golden eyes. Whatever had driven Zippy to run away was still weighing heavily on the young creature's mind. Marcus had been doing some research during his quiet moments, accessing the galactic databases to learn more about dragon culture and development. What he found both fascinated and troubled him. Dragons were indeed among the galaxy's most ancient and powerful species, with abilities that bordered on the magical. But their society was also highly traditional and hierarchical, with strict expectations for how young dragons should develop. The ability to breathe fire was considered a fundamental milestone, typically achieved within the first few months of life. Dragons who were late to develop this ability often faced social stigma and pressure that could have lasting psychological effects. In extreme cases, such youngsters were removed from their families and placed in specialized institutions until they could master their flame. The more Marcus learned, the more his protective instincts toward Zippy intensified. He couldn't imagine sending such a bright, loving creature away just because it was developing at its own pace. The very idea made him angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. On the fourth day of their cohabitation, Marcus's peaceful routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. He was in the middle of explaining the principles of combustion to Zippy, using simple diagrams drawn on his tablet, when someone knocked on his workshop door. "Mr. Chen," came a refined voice from outside. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Marcus glanced at Zippy, who immediately went perfectly still, scales darkening with alarm. The dragon had developed an uncanny ability to sense when someone might pose a threat, and its reaction told Marcus to be very careful. "Just a moment," Marcus called out, quickly scooping up Zippy and placing the dragon in a hidden compartment he'd created behind one of his larger tool cabinets. "Stay quiet, okay?" Zippy nodded understanding and settled into the small space without protest. Marcus made sure the compartment was properly concealed before opening the workshop door. Standing outside was a dragon of impressive bearing, middle-aged by the standards of the species, wearing elaborate robes that spoke of high rank and authority. The being's scales were a deep crimson shot through with veins of gold, and its eyes held an intelligence that was both sharp and calculating. "Mr. Chen, I presume? I am Counselor Thane Ironskill of the Draconic High Council. I believe you may have information relevant to a matter of considerable importance to my people." Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. This was clearly one of the powerful dragons looking for Zippy, and everything about the being's manner suggested this was not a friendly social call. "I'm not sure what information I could have that would interest the High Council," Marcus said carefully. "I'm just a mechanic." Counselor Ironscale's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Come now, Mr. Chen, there's no need for false modesty. Your reputation for finding things is well known throughout the station." The way the dragon emphasized finding things made Marcus's skin crawl. There was an implicit threat in those words, a suggestion that Marcus's refusal to cooperate might have unpleasant consequences. "I find broken equipment and fix it," Marcus said evenly. "That's what mechanics do." "Indeed, and sometimes I'm told you find other things as well, lost items, stray creatures perhaps." The dragon's eyes were fixed on Marcus with uncomfortable intensity. Marcus had the distinct feeling that Counselor Ironskill already knew exactly what he wanted to hear, and was simply going through the motions of polite inquiry. "If you're asking whether I've found a missing dragon," Marcus said, deciding directness was his best option, "then no, I haven't. And even if I had, wouldn't the proper procedure be to file a report with station security? I'm not aware of any regulation that makes mechanics responsible for returning lost beings to anyone who asks." For the first time, Counselor Ironskill's composed expression showed a flicker of annoyance. "Mr. Chen, I think you may not fully understand the situation. The individual we seek is not simply lost. They are a member of a very important family who has been misdirected by unfortunate influences. It is imperative that they be returned to proper supervision before their condition worsens." Their condition? A developmental disorder that requires immediate specialized treatment. Every moment of delay makes successful intervention less likely. Marcus felt cold anger building in his chest. The way this dragon spoke about what was clearly Zippy made his skin crawl. There was no compassion in those words, no genuine concern for a child's well-being. This was about control and conformity, not care. "That sounds like a family matter," Marcus said, "and a medical one. I'm not qualified to get involved in either." Counselor Ironskill stepped closer, and Marcus was suddenly very aware of the size difference between them. Even without considering the dragon's magical abilities, the being was physically imposing enough to be intimidating. "Mr. Chen, I hope you understand that interfering with draconic family affairs could have serious diplomatic consequences. The High Council values its relationship with the human territories. but that relationship depends on mutual respect and cooperation. The threat was no longer implicit. Marcus felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting into a confrontation with a member of the Draconic High Council would help no one, least of all Zippy. "I appreciate your concern for diplomatic relations," Marcus said. "I'm sure if there really is a missing dragon from an important family, the proper authorities will handle the situation appropriately. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He started to close the door, but Counselor Ironskill placed one clawed hand against it, preventing it from shutting. "Mr. Chen, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. The individual we seek will not be harmed, quite the contrary. They will receive the best possible care and training to help them overcome their limitations. Surely you wouldn't want to stand in the way of a child receiving proper medical attention." The manipulation in those words was so blatant that Marcus had to bite his tongue to keep from responding angrily. Everything he had learned about Zippy suggested an intelligent, emotionally healthy youngling who was simply developing at their own pace. The idea that this needed to be corrected through forced institutional care was repugnant. "Like I said, Counselor, I haven't found any missing dragons. And even if I had, I'd want to be very sure they were going to people who had their best interests at heart before I'd consider turning them over to anyone." This time, Counselor Ironskill's expression showed genuine anger. "Your species is known for its stubbornness, Mr. Chen, but this borders on foolishness. You are involving yourself in matters far beyond your understanding." "Then maybe you should help me understand," Marcus said, allowing some of his own anger to show. "Explain to me why a young dragon who seems perfectly healthy and intelligent would need to be forcibly removed from wherever they are and placed in some kind of institution. Help me understand why their family isn't handling this privately instead of sending High Council members to intimidate mechanics." For a moment, Counselor Ironskill looked genuinely surprised, as if the possibility that a human might question draconic authority had never occurred to him. Then his expression hardened into something genuinely threatening. "You forget yourself, human. The affairs of the draconic hegemony are not subject to your approval or understanding. I will ask you one final time. Do you have any information regarding the whereabouts of Prince Zephyr Stormscale?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Prince. Zippy wasn't just from an important family, he was dragon royalty, and suddenly everything made sense. This wasn't about a family trying to help a struggling child. This was about political pressure on the royal family to conform to traditional expectations. "No," Marcus said firmly, "I don't know anything about any princes." Counselor Ironskill studied his face for a long moment, then stepped back. "Very well, Mr. Chen, but understand this. Prince Zephyr will be found with or without your cooperation. And when he is, those who aided his defiance will be held accountable." The dragon turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in his doorway with his heart pounding. As soon as the corridor was clear, he quickly shut and locked the door, then hurried to release Zippy from hiding. The young dragon emerged from the compartment with scales so dark they were almost black. It was trembling, and when it looked at Marcus, there were what could only be tears in those golden eyes. "Hey, it's okay," Marcus said softly, gently lifting the dragon and holding it close to his chest. "He's gone, you're safe." Zippy buried his small head against Marcus's shirt and made soft, distressed sounds that broke the human's heart. Marcus found himself stroking the dragon's head instinctively, murmuring reassurances. "So you're Prince Zephyr," Marcus said quietly. "That's quite a fancy name for such a little guy." At the sound of his real name, Zippy Zephyr looked up at Marcus with eyes full of fear and hope. The dragon seemed to be searching Marcus's face for any sign that learning his true identity had changed how the human felt about him. "Don't worry," Marcus said firmly. "Prince or not, you're still the same little dragon who likes bubbles and is learning to control his breathing. That's all that matters to me." Zephyr's scales began to brighten slightly, and he made a soft trilling sound that Marcus had learned meant contentment. But the fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. "That dragon, Counselor Ironskill, he wants to take you away, doesn't he? To one of those institutions where they try to force young dragons to develop their abilities." Zephyr nodded miserably, then began the complex series of gestures he used to communicate more detailed concepts. Marcus watched carefully as the young dragon told his story through movement and expression. From what Marcus could understand, Zephyr's inability to breathe fire had become a source of embarrassment for certain members of the royal court. The traditional faction, led by dragons like Counselor Ironskill, had been pressuring the royal family to send Zephyr away for corrective treatment. The pressure had become so intense that Zephyr had finally run away rather than face the humiliation and isolation of institutional care. "Your parents," Marcus said carefully, "what do they think about all this?" Zephyr's expression became complex, mixing love, sadness, and frustration. His gestures suggested that while his parents loved him, they were caught between their desire to protect him and the political realities of ruling the draconic hegemony. The pressure from the traditional faction was apparently significant enough to threaten the stability of the government. "So they can't openly oppose the council's recommendations without causing a political crisis," Marcus said, understanding dawning. "And you ran away to protect them from having to make that choice." Zephyr nodded, and Marcus felt his admiration for the young dragon grow even stronger. Despite being just a child, Zephyr had recognized the impossible position his situation was creating for his family, and had tried to solve the problem by removing himself from the equation. "You know that running away doesn't actually solve anything, right?" Marcus said gently. "Your parents are probably worried sick about you, and the council is just going to keep pressuring them until you're found." Zephyr's scales darkened again, and he curled up into a small ball of misery. Marcus could see that the young dragon understood the futility of his situation, but simply couldn't bear the thought of being sent away. "Hey," Marcus said, an idea beginning to form. "What if there was another option? What if we could prove to the council that you don't need institutional treatment?" Zephyr looked up hopefully, but Marcus could see doubt in those expressive eyes. The young dragon had clearly been told many times that his inability to breathe fire was a serious problem that required drastic intervention. "I've been thinking about your breathing exercises," Marcus continued. "You've made incredible progress in just a few days. What if the problem isn't that you can't learn? What if you just need a different approach?" Marcus moved to his workstation and pulled up the research he'd been conducting on dragon physiology. "Look at this," he said, angling the screen so Zephyr could see. "Fire breathing isn't just about having the ability, it's about understanding the chemistry and physics involved. Maybe instead of trying to force it to happen naturally, we need to approach it like an engineering problem." Zephyr's scales began to brighten with interest as Marcus explained his theory. Dragons were supposed to breathe fire through a combination of internal chemical production and precise muscular control. Most dragons developed this ability instinctively, but for those who didn't, traditional dragon teaching methods relied entirely on instinct and natural development. "What if we break it down into component parts?" Marcus suggested. "You've already mastered breath control through the bubble exercises. Now we need to work on the chemical production aspect." He pulled up detailed diagrams of dragon anatomy, focusing on the specialized organs responsible for producing the flammable compounds that made fire breathing possible. "These organs are there," he said, pointing to the relevant areas. "They just need the right stimulation to start working properly." Over the next several hours, Marcus and Zephyr worked together to develop a scientific approach to fire breathing. Using his engineering background, Marcus created exercises designed to activate specific muscle groups and breathing patterns. He researched dietary supplements that might help stimulate the production of necessary chemicals, and designed graduated training programs that built on Zephyr's existing abilities. The young dragon threw himself into the work with enthusiasm that broke Marcus's heart. Here was a brilliant, eager student who had been told he was defective simply because he learned differently than others. With the right approach and patient instruction, Marcus was convinced Zephyr could master fire breathing within weeks rather than months. But even as they worked, Marcus was aware that time was running short. Counselor Ironskill would not give up easily, and other members of the High Council would likely be pressuring station authorities to conduct a more thorough search. If they were going to prove Zephyr's capabilities, they needed to do it quickly. What Marcus didn't know was that their conversation had been monitored by someone with the technology and authority to do so undetected. Queen Lyrelith had been following her son's progress with growing amazement and pride. Watching Marcus's patient, scientific approach to Zephyr's challenges had convinced her that this human possessed exactly the kind of innovative thinking her people needed. But the Queen also knew that Counselor Ironskill would not be satisfied with gradual progress. The traditional faction of the High Council was determined to use Zephyr's situation to prove their point about the need for strict conformity to draconic norms. They would continue to pressure for immediate action, regardless of any improvements the prince might show. It was time for Queen Lyrelith to reveal herself and her plans for the future, plans that would depend heavily on the remarkable human who had shown such unexpected wisdom and compassion in caring for her son. But first, she wanted to see just how far Marcus was willing to go to protect a young dragon he had known for less than a week. The test she had in mind would challenge everything Marcus believed about right and wrong, and force him to choose between his own safety and Zephyr's well-being. The results would determine not only her son's fate, but the future relationship between humans and dragons throughout the galaxy. The breakthrough came on the 7th day. Marcus had been working with Zephyr on a complex breathing exercise that combined elements of their bubble practice with specific muscle contractions he'd identified through his research. The young dragon had been growing increasingly frustrated as each attempt produced only warm air instead of the flame they were working toward. "Remember, it's not about forcing it," Marcus said patiently, though he could see the discouragement in Zephyr's posture. "Think of it like starting an engine. All the components have to work together in the right sequence." Zephyr took a deep breath, his small chest expanding as he prepared for another attempt. Marcus watched carefully as the dragon went through the sequence they'd developed. Proper posture, controlled inhalation, activation of the specialized muscles, and then the critical moment of exhalation combined with chemical ignition. This time, instead of just warm air, a small flicker of actual flame emerged from Zephyr's snout. It lasted only a fraction of a second and was barely visible, but it was undeniably fire. Both Marcus and Zephyr stared in stunned silence for a moment before the young dragon's scales exploded into brilliant gold and purple patterns of pure joy. "You did it," Marcus exclaimed, unable to contain his excitement. "That was real fire, I saw it." Zephyr bounced around the workshop in celebration, chirping and trilling with delight. His movements were so energetic that Marcus worried he might knock over some of the delicate equipment, but the dragon's natural grace kept him from causing any damage. Okay, let's try it again," Marcus said, grinning widely. "Now that we know it works, let's see if we can make it bigger and more consistent." Over the next few hours, Zephyr's fire production steadily improved. The flames were still small and brief, but they were real fire, and they were happening with increasing regularity. More importantly, Zephyr was beginning to understand the process on an intellectual level rather than relying purely on instinct. "The key is thinking about it like a controlled chemical reaction," Marcus explained as they took a break. "Most dragons learn it intuitively, but there's no reason the logical approach can't work just as well." Zephyr nodded enthusiastically, his confidence visibly growing with each successful attempt. The fear and sadness that had shadowed his expressions since Marcus first found him were being replaced by the natural curiosity and joy of a healthy young dragon. Their celebration was interrupted by the sound of multiple footsteps in the corridor outside. Marcus's blood ran cold as he recognized the deliberate, authoritative rhythm of military or security personnel. Zephyr's scales immediately darkened as he heard the sound as well. "Hide," Marcus whispered urgently, but before Zephyr could move toward his usual hiding spot, the workshop door burst open. 3 figures entered without invitation. Counselor Ironskill, accompanied by 2 station security officers. Behind them came a 4th being that Marcus didn't recognize another dragon, but one whose bearing and elaborate attire suggested even higher rank than the counselor. "Mr. Chen," Counselor Ironskill said with cold satisfaction, "I believe you've met Station Security Chief Marek and Commander Voss, and this is High Adjudicator Korthak of the Draconic Supreme Council." The High Adjudicator stepped forward, and Marcus felt the weight of ancient authority in the being's presence. This dragon was clearly very old and very powerful, with scales that seemed to shimmer between dark silver and black. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Human," the High Adjudicator said, his gaze fixed on Zephyr, who had frozen in place beside Marcus's workbench. "You will surrender Prince Zephyr immediately. Your interference in draconic affairs has gone far enough." Marcus felt fear twist in his stomach, but he also felt something else, a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. Looking down at Zephyr, who was trembling despite his earlier joy, Marcus made a decision that he knew would change his life forever. "No," he said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Both security officers reached for their weapons, while Counselor Ironskill's expression shifted from satisfaction to shock. The High Adjudicator's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I beg your pardon?" the High Adjudicator said in a voice that could have frozen helium. "I said no," Marcus repeated, moving to place himself between the dragons and Zephyr. "This young dragon is here voluntarily. He's not being held against his will, and he's not in any danger. I see no legal basis for removing him forcibly." "Legal basis," Counselor Ironskill sputtered. "This is the crown prince of the draconic hegemony. He belongs with his family." "Then where is his family?" Marcus asked pointedly. "I see council members and security officers, but I don't see any parents or guardians who are actually responsible for his welfare." The High Adjudicator stepped closer, and Marcus could feel the heat radiating from the massive dragon's body. "You dare to question the authority of the Draconic Council? You presume to know what is best for one of our people." "I presume to care about the welfare of a scared child who ran away from home, rather than face being institutionalized for developing at his own pace," Marcus shot back. "And I presume to believe that no one council member or not has the right to force treatment on someone who doesn't need it." "Doesn't need it?" The High Adjudicator's voice rose dangerously. "The prince is defective. He cannot perform the most basic function of our species. He requires immediate corrective intervention." "He's not defective," Marcus said firmly. "He's just different, and there's nothing wrong with different." To prove his point, Marcus turned to Zephyr. "Show them," he said quietly. "Show them what you can do." Zephyr looked terrified, his scales so dark they appeared almost black. But when he met Marcus's encouraging gaze, something in the human's expression seemed to give him courage. The young dragon straightened to his full height, took a deep breath, and executed the breathing sequence Marcus had taught him. A clear, steady flame emerged from Zephyr's snout, not large, but unmistakably real fire that he maintained for several seconds before letting it fade. The dragons in the room stared in stunned silence. "Impossible," Counselor Ironskill breathed. "How?" "Science," Marcus said simply. "Patient instruction, treating him like an intelligent being capable of learning rather than a defective specimen to be fixed. Novel concepts, I know." The High Adjudicator's expression had shifted from anger to something more complex. "You taught him to breathe fire in a matter of days." "He taught himself," Marcus corrected. "I just helped him understand the process and gave him the confidence to try. Everything he needed was already there. It just required a different approach than traditional dragon training methods." For a moment, Marcus thought he might have actually gotten through to them. The High Adjudicator was studying Zephyr with new interest, and even Counselor Ironskill looked uncertain. Then the High Adjudicator's expression hardened again. "Irrelevant," he declared. "The prince has defied the lawful commands of the council and must face the consequences of his actions. His ability or inability to breathe fire is no longer the issue." Marcus felt his heart sink. So this was never really about helping him at all, was it? This is about control, about making sure no one questions the council's authority. "The stability of our society depends on respect for traditional values and hierarchies," the High Adjudicator said coldly. "The prince's defiance sets a dangerous precedent that cannot be tolerated." "His defiance?" Marcus's voice rose with anger. "He's a child who was scared of being taken away from his family and locked up in an institution. What did you expect him to do?" "I expected him to accept the wisdom of his elders and submit to proper treatment," the High Adjudicator replied. "As I expect you to step aside and allow us to correct this situation." "And if I refuse?" The High Adjudicator's smile was cold and predatory. "Then you will be charged with kidnapping a member of the draconic royal family, interfering with official council business, and contributing to the corruption of a minor. The penalties for such crimes are severe." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. He had no legal standing to protect Zephyr, no authority that could match the council's power, and no resources to fight beings who could reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. But looking down at the young dragon who had placed such trust in him, Marcus knew he couldn't simply give up. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Someone in Zephyr's family who can speak for him. His parents, surely they—" The queen and king are bound by the same laws and traditions that govern all of our people, Counselor Ironskill interrupted. They cannot simply override the council's judgment based on personal sentiment. Personal sentiment? Marcus exploded. We're talking about their child. We are talking about the crown prince, the high adjudicator corrected icily. And the crown prince belongs to the draconic people, not to any individual regardless of blood relation. The callousness of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. These beings were talking about Zephyr as if he were property rather than a living, feeling creature with his own thoughts and fears. The realization that such an attitude could exist among supposedly advanced beings made him feel sick. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension in the room. That, said a new voice from the doorway, is quite enough. Everyone turned toward the entrance to see a figure that made even the high adjudicator step back in surprise. The dragon who entered the workshop was magnificent beyond description, scales that shifted through every color of the aurora, a presence that seemed to fill the entire space despite her moderate size, and eyes that held depths of wisdom and power that spoke of millennia of experience. Your Majesty, the high adjudicator said, dropping immediately into a deep bow. We were not aware. Clearly, Queen Lyrelith said, her voice carrying absolute authority. If you had been aware of my presence, perhaps you would have conducted yourselves with more dignity befitting your positions. Marcus stared in amazement as he realized what was happening. This was Zephyr's mother, the Dragon Queen herself, and from the way she was looking at the council members, it was clear she had heard everything that had been said. Your Majesty, Counselor Ironskill began nervously, we were simply executing the council's decision regarding Prince Zephyr's treatment. Without consulting the prince's parents, the Queen interrupted coldly. Without considering alternative approaches, without even attempting to understand the situation beyond your own rigid preconceptions. Her gaze shifted to Marcus, and he found himself looking into eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. But instead of the anger or condemnation he expected, he saw something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Mr. Chen, the Queen said formally, I believe you have been caring for my son. Yes, Your Majesty, Marcus managed, not sure of the proper protocol but determined to be honest. He was lost and scared, and I couldn't just leave him alone. Lost and scared, the Queen repeated, her gaze shifting back to the council members. Interesting, and yet the council's reports described him as willfully defiant and in need of immediate corrective action. The high adjudicator straightened, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Your Majesty, with respect, the prince's emotional state does not change the facts of his condition or the necessity of proper intervention. And what condition is that exactly? The Queen asked with deceptive calm. His inability to breathe fire, obviously. It is a fundamental deficiency that requires. The Queen held up one clawed hand for silence. Zephyr, she said gently, would you please demonstrate your current abilities for the high adjudicator? Zephyr looked nervously between his mother and the council members, but at her encouraging nod, he took a deep breath and produced another flame, this one larger and more controlled than his earlier demonstration. The fire burned steadily for nearly 10 seconds before he let it fade. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, the Queen spoke again. It appears, she said in a voice that could cut diamonds, that the only fundamental deficiency in this situation was the council's approach to my son's education. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but the high adjudicator was not finished. Your Majesty, he said stiffly, while this development is unexpected, it does not address the larger issue of the prince's defiance of lawful authority, the precedent. The precedent, the Queen interrupted, her voice rising with royal fury, is that when the supposedly wise members of our council are so blinded by tradition that they cannot see past their own prejudices, it falls to strangers to provide the wisdom and compassion that should have been offered by his own people. She moved closer to Marcus, and he found himself the focus of her intense attention. Mr. Chen, my son appears to have thrived under your care. May I ask what methods you used to help him achieve what our most learned instructors could not? Marcus glanced at Zephyr, who nodded encouragingly. I treated him like any other student, Marcus said honestly. I tried to understand what he needed rather than forcing him to fit a predetermined mold, and I made sure he knew that his worth as an individual wasn't dependent on mastering any particular skill. The Queen's expression softened, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the mother behind the royal authority. "You gave him confidence," she said quietly, "and respect, two things that are apparently in short supply among certain members of my own court." The High Adjudicator's face had darkened with anger and humiliation. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be considering allowing this alien interference in the education of the Crown Prince to continue." "On the contrary," Queen Lyrillith said, turning to face him directly, "I am considering making Mr. Chen's alien interference an official part of my son's education." The words hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Marcus felt his jaw drop as the implications of what the Queen was suggesting began to sink in. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Draconic Royal Academy, watching Zephyr lead a group of young dragons through an advanced fire-breathing exercise. The technique they were practicing was one Marcus had developed specifically for dragons who struggled with traditional training methods, and it had proven remarkably effective. "Breathe control first," Zephyr called out to his students, his voice carrying the confidence that had grown steadily since that first day in the storage bay. "Remember, fire is just controlled combustion. Understand the process, and the process becomes natural." Marcus smiled as he watched his former pupil, now his teaching partner, guide another young dragon through the steps they had worked out together. What had started as a desperate attempt to help one scared little dragon had evolved into something that was transforming dragon education throughout the hegemony. "He has become quite the instructor," came a familiar voice from behind him. Marcus turned to see Queen Lyrillith approaching. Her scales shimmering with what he had learned were colors of contentment and pride. Over the past months, he had gotten much better at reading dragon emotional expressions, though he suspected he would never achieve the instant understanding that dragons had with each other. "He's amazing," Marcus agreed, turning back to watch Zephyr work with his students. "I think he's going to be a better teacher than I ever was. He understands what these kids are going through in a way I never could." The Queen joined him at the viewing window, and for a moment they stood in comfortable silence watching the class. The changes in both Zephyr and the Academy had been dramatic. What had once been a rigid institution focused on forcing conformity had become a place where different learning styles were not only accepted but celebrated. "The Council has formally requested that your teaching methods be implemented in all dragon academies throughout the hegemony," the Queen said. "They are calling it the Chen Protocol, though I suspect you find that designation somewhat embarrassing." Marcus laughed, still not entirely comfortable with having his name attached to educational reforms that were spreading across dozens of worlds. "It feels weird having something named after me, especially something so important." "You revolutionized our approach to education," the Queen pointed out. "You proved that intelligence and worth cannot be measured by a single standard. That seems worthy of recognition." Through the window, they could see one of Zephyr's students, a young dragon who had been struggling for weeks, suddenly produce her first successful flame. The joy on her face was immediately matched by Zephyr's enthusiastic celebration and the cheers of her classmates. "That never gets old," Marcus said softly, "seeing a kid finally master something they thought they couldn't do." "Zephyr tells me you have been invited to address the Galactic Education Council next month," the Queen said. "That is quite an honor for someone who claims to be just a mechanic." Marcus shrugged, though he was secretly pleased by the recognition. Turns out fixing things and teaching aren't that different. Both require patience, observation, and willingness to try new approaches when the old ones don't work. The Queen's expression became more serious. "There is something I have been wanting to discuss with you, Marcus, about the future." Something in her tone made Marcus look at her more carefully. "What kind of future?" "Zephyr will be assuming greater responsibilities as he matures," she explained. "Eventually, he will need to take his place as Crown Prince in more than just name. When that time comes, he will need advisors who understand him, who share his vision for how our society can evolve." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. "Your Majesty, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of responsibility." "You taught my son that being different is not the same as being defective," the Queen said firmly. "You showed him that tradition and progress can coexist. Most importantly, you demonstrated that true strength comes from understanding and compassion rather than from forcing others to conform. If that doesn't qualify you to help guide the future of our society, then I don't know what would. Through the window, Zephyr caught sight of them and waved enthusiastically. Marcus waved back, his chest tight with emotion as he remembered the frightened little dragon he had found in that storage bay. "He's going to be an amazing leader someday," Marcus said, "with or without my help." "Perhaps," the Queen agreed, "but I believe he will be even better with it, and I believe you know that as well." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the magnitude of what she was offering. When he had first blown bubbles for a lonely little dragon, he could never have imagined that it would lead to this, to a complete transformation in how an entire civilization approached education and development. "What would it involve?" he asked finally. "Initially, continuing what you're already doing, developing new teaching methods, training instructors, helping dragons who struggle with traditional approaches. But eventually, if you're willing, it could mean becoming a permanent advisor to the Crown Prince and having a voice in shaping policy throughout the hegemony." The weight of the opportunity was almost overwhelming. This was a chance to influence the direction of one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, to help ensure that future generations of dragons would never face the kind of pressure and rejection that had driven Zephyr to run away. "Can I think about it?" Marcus asked. "Of course, this is not a decision to be made lightly." The Queen paused, then added, "Though I should mention that Zephyr has already expressed strong opinions about your answer." "Oh, really?" "He informed me that if you declined, he would resign his position as Crown Prince and become a full-time teacher instead. Apparently, he believes that education reform is more important than royal duties." Marcus laughed, recognizing Zephyr's characteristic blend of determination and dramatic flair. "That sounds like him, always thinking about the bigger picture." "It is one of the qualities that will make him a good ruler," the Queen said, "along with the compassion and innovative thinking he learned from you." As they watched, Zephyr's class came to an end, and the young dragons dispersed to their other activities. But instead of following his students, Zephyr headed directly for the observation deck where Marcus and his mother were standing. "Marcus," he called out as he burst through the doors, his scales bright with excitement. "Did you see Kira's breakthrough? She finally got it, and the technique we developed for dragons with respiratory variations worked perfectly." The enthusiasm in Zephyr's voice and the way his eyes lit up when he talked about teaching reminded Marcus powerfully of that first moment when the young dragon had successfully guided a bubble through the air. The core of who Zephyr was hadn't changed. He was still curious, compassionate, and deeply invested in helping others succeed. "I saw," Marcus said, grinning. "You're becoming quite the instructor, Your Highness." "Don't call me that in the academy," Zephyr said with mock seriousness. "Here I'm just Teacher Zephyr. Royal titles interfere with the learning environment." Queen Lyrelith raised an eyebrow at her son's declaration, but Marcus could see she was more amused than annoyed. "Your instructors at the royal palace might disagree with that philosophy." "Then maybe it's time to reform the royal palace too," Zephyr said with the kind of casual confidence that only teenagers could muster when proposing to revolutionize centuries of tradition. Marcus and the Queen exchanged glances, and Marcus could see the pride and slight exasperation in her expression. Zephyr had definitely inherited the royal tendency toward ambitious thinking. "Speaking of the future," Zephyr continued, turning to Marcus with an expression of barely contained excitement, "I've been working on some ideas for expanding our education programs. What if we created exchange programs with other species? Human engineers could learn dragon techniques, and dragons could study human problem-solving methods." The idea was so typically Zephyr, innovative, inclusive, and completely unconcerned with traditional boundaries between species. Marcus found himself caught up in the young dragon's enthusiasm despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "That would be complicated," Marcus said carefully. "But interesting. You'd need to work out all kinds of logistical and political issues." "That's why I need good advisors," Zephyr said with a meaningful look. "People who understand both the technical challenges and the importance of treating every individual with respect, regardless of their species or learning style." Marcus realized he was being recruited, and not particularly subtly. But looking at Zephyr's eager expression and thinking about all the young dragons whose lives could be improved by continued educational reforms, he found his resistance crumbling. You know, Marcus said slowly, I might have some ideas about how something like that could work. Zephyr's scales exploded into brilliant patterns of joy, while Queen Lyrelith smiled with satisfaction. Excellent, she said. I'll have the official paperwork prepared. Welcome to the service of the Draconic Crown, Advisor Chen. Wait, Marcus said, suddenly realizing what had just happened. I didn't actually say yes yet. Didn't you? Zephyr asked innocently. Because it sounded like you did, and once you start working on implementation ideas, you're basically committed anyway. That's how these things work. Marcus looked between the young dragon and his mother, both of whom were watching him with expressions of amused certainty. He realized he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by beings who had been playing political games since before humans had discovered fire. You two planned this, didn't you? He accused. I prefer to think of it as creating optimal conditions for the right decision, Queen Lyrelith said diplomatically. We knew you'd say yes eventually, Zephyr added more directly. We just helped you realize it sooner rather than later. Despite being manipulated, Marcus found himself laughing. There were worse fates than being talked into helping to improve education.